Hello, everyone, and welcome to Food History Weekend 2023 and today's conversation circle, Aquaculture and Urban Agriculture During Climate Crisis. I'm Paula Johnson, the curator of food history and the head of the food history team here at the National Museum of American History. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here on site and online streaming to this important discussion with two extraordinary women who are addressing food production and resource stewardship in the face of environmental change. This conversation will be led by our wonderful colleague, Dr. Rachel Seidman, who is the American Women's History Initiative Curator of Environmental History at the Smithsonian's Anacostia Community Museum. Rachel curated an incredibly important exhibition, To Live and Breathe, Women and Environmental Justice in Washington, D.C., which is on view at the Anacostia Community Museum until January 7th, 2024. I hope you all can find time to visit. It's well worth it. Before we dive in, I'm pleased to say that this program received federal support from the Smithsonian American Women's History Initiative Pool, administered by the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum, which is one of our new museums coming soon on the mall, or coming on the mall, whenever. But thank you for your participation and support, and now let me turn things over to Rachel.
Thank you, Paula, for that kind introduction and for mentioning the exhibition. And I just want to add a little bit to that, which is that Imani Black here is featured in that exhibition. So I'm sure by the end of our conversation, you will want even more to come over and see the exhibition. I'm so delighted to be here with you today and with these fabulous guests. But before I introduce them, I just have a couple of things to say. First of all, this conversation circle is a 1 hour long program, and we encourage audience participation. There will be a sort of time for a Q&A at the end, but you don't actually have to wait until the end. If you have a burning question, just raise your hand and wait for someone to bring you a microphone, and we will get to you. For those of you on social media, please tag this museum at @AmHistoryMuseum, and please include the hashtags Smithsonian Food and Smithsonian Women's History. So now I'm going to introduce my wonderful guests. To my far right is Qiana Mickie. Qiana Mickie is a Harlem-based food systems and equity leader, speaker, and she's the founding principal of QJM Multiprize. For over 12 years, Qiana has worked to foster viable economic opportunities for small to mid-scale food and farm businesses, as well as youth, mixed income, Black, brown, and other communities of color. She also brings this equity-driven lens to her policy work on issues such as food sovereignty, land stewardship, and climate justice. Qiana is the former executive director of Just Food and serves on the International Council of Urgency Coordination Committee of the Civil Society Mechanism for the United Nations. Qiana is the inaugural executive director for the New York City Mayor's Office of Urban Agriculture. She leads the city's efforts to advance urban agriculture and equity to address climate, food, and wealth disparities in New York City's natural and built environment. Qiana has a BS in marketing from Hampton University and received her Food Hub Management certification from the University of Vermont. Welcome, Qiana.
Thank you. Thank you.
And Imani Black here on my right is founder and CEO of Minorities in Aquaculture, which works to educate underrepresented demographics about the environmental benefits provided by both local and global aquaculture in order to promote a more diverse, inclusive aquaculture industry. MIA strives to bridge the gap between minority women and career paths in the sustainable seafood industry by providing the needed access to financial, social, and cultural resources in order to maximize their impact on the aquaculture and seafood industry. Ms. Black herself is an African-American oyster farmer building a career in the rapidly growing aquaculture industry. A graduate of Old Dominion University, she is currently pursuing a master's degree, she's really almost done, at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science at Horn Point Laboratory in the Marine Estuarine Environmental Sciences program. Wow. Yeah. She was born and raised on the eastern shore of Maryland, and her love for conservation and restoration on the Chesapeake Bay started at a young age. Imani comes from a long family history of watermen from Rock Hill, Crisfield, and Cambridge, Maryland that dates back over 200 years. Welcome, Imani.
Thank you.
So I'm going to get us going with some questions for both of them, but I will try to keep my eye on you all, so if you have questions also, you can raise your hand. So, Qiana and Imani. Qiana, your work in New York City focuses on supporting farming in an urban setting.
Yes.
And Imani, you farm in water.
Yes.
Neither of these is what we usually think of when we imagine farming. Can each of you just spend a little time describing the actual work? You might describe a day or an hour or however you want to approach it, but actually what do you do? And help us understand more what that's like. You want to, you can start.
Yeah, I'll start us off. Well, yeah, so it's really simple. Aquaculture makes it sound really complicated, but if you think about it, it's just what we do on land, we do that in the water with seafood. So we are mimicking what naturally happens. So like specifically with oysters, we are just going with their natural process of reproduction, of growth, and things like that, but just trying to maximize it. So it's not a GMO thing. It goes by natural selection. We take adult oysters, put them in different ecosystems around the Chesapeake Bay so they can build like different defenses against like high salinity or low salinity or different ecological changes that could happen. And then from there, we take those ones that have survived like that time period and we reproduce them so that their babies will then have that same characteristics. So that's, it's mostly in a controlled environment that we do kind of the hatchery side, but then when they get to being adults or growing to be adults, they are just out in cages that we just, maintenance pretty much every other day. So oysters are very temperamental. They don't care about holidays or your birthday or anything like that. It is a year-round type of job. But yeah, it's mostly, there's a lot of misconceptions about it, but it's really simple once you really see it.
That's great. I wish I could explain my work as simply as that. But yes, so my work, I feel like my work is around connective tissue. So I engage with gardeners, land stewards, farmers, policy advocates, and even community chefs. And oftentimes these are folks that are have gotten either interested based on their past history around food and agriculture and wanting to connect that in an urban setting, oftentimes where they live or neighborhoods nearby, or they feel that they are destined to react or respond to disparities that they're feeling and want to see change. So for me, I feel like my work is like connective tissue around connecting folks that are the most impacted to become the most activated and build stronger connections through resources, whether that's through training or funding or grant writing or advocacy, to help them really do the work that they know needs to get done in a way that they want to envision it. So oftentimes it looks self-driven or community-driven work. And it often is rooted in either agriculture, food, whether it's growing, harvesting, or producing. Now that I work for the city, I try to take those same principles around equity and continue that North Star of my work, which is environmental, racial, and economic equity. Now, on my city job, in my city hat, what I try to do there is think about the city assets that, again, should transform into programming initiatives that are going to have the most impact for New Yorkers. So what's good for New York and good for New York City. And around urban agriculture, since some folks are growing. We have a history of folks growing through sweat equity, volunteerism. What I want to continue to see and support is the breadth of urban agriculture in New York City, so that growth production, if folks want to do it for healing and respite, they can, but are we continuing to create economic opportunity around food and ag in a city where those folks that have historically been marginalized are actually not marginalized in economic opportunity? So if folks want to do that for a living, how do we make sure there's entry points in that? So real quick examples are, I have helped get funding to build a Black farmer food hub focus training where farmers, rural and urban, were able to think about their work in terms of, and get funding to focus on how to identify supply that they would want to bring into a food hub in New York City, like a community-based food hub. I did that before my city job, where we explored supply, culturally relevant food. We gave them the chance to connect with business training so they could really think about what are the baselines that they needed to make their business viable. And then also, what are the connections forward? How to talk about your work in a pitch and do pitch deck. So we did some of that. And in the city, something similar is I've started working in collaboration with our school food office around building a farmer-producer training to connect to school food procurement and how to get culturally relevant food from socially disadvantaged farmers in our city that they can connect their production, get procurement contracts to get food there into schools, but also have an access opportunity to students so they could see and learn that there are farmers that look like them, can grow, and so while students are learning how to grow in the classrooms, they're connected to farmers who are growing at scale.
We have so many similarities, it's crazy.
Yes.
Actually, I was thinking the same thing, Imani.
Yeah, you just explain it better.
And I was going to ask you, because a lot of what Qiana's talking about, I know that you share some of those similar goals and approaches, and you described your work as an oyster farmer, but you didn't describe your work as the founder and leader of Minorities in Aquaculture. So why don't you say a little bit more about Minorities in Aquaculture and what the goals of that organization are and how you're going about those things?
Yeah, no, I think I automatically go to oyster farming because I'm not on the water as much as I want to be these days. So it's just me trying to just speak it into existence a little bit more. But yeah, so on top of going to school and getting my master's, I also have this nonprofit, Minorities in Aquaculture, which is really, really stemmed from my career as an oyster farmer on the Eastern Shore, because I, didn't really see anybody that looked like me and really just kind of went down, well, let me just find another woman of color. So over the last 3 years, it's really gotten to, we are the bridge between kind of what Qiana was saying of how do we bring people into a space that they haven't been introduced to in that way before, but also from a point of DEI, but also from everybody eats, right?
Yes, exactly.
There's such a baseline of it is DEI, but really everyone is connected to seafood. If you go to the grocery store, 9 times out of 10, that is a farm-raised piece of seafood. Not everybody knows that. Not everybody's literate in that. And so we are, kind of going through this workforce development stage right now in aquaculture, and will be for the next couple of years. So I'm basically just taking the DEI approaches that work in different communities with women of color, with women in general, the LGBTQ+ community, disabilities, prison reform, kind of anybody that's not involved in aquaculture right now, and saying how do we get them into understanding how to be a long-term steward here and make more sustainable choices. And how do we give them kind of a pathway into aquaculture that's not just being out on a farm, right? Because like I said, it's a little crazy to be out there on the water when it's raining and snowing and sleeting, and those oysters do not care. You have to get the work done. But everybody doesn't want to be out on a farm. Right. And also everybody has different skills that they bring to the table, that I think that aquaculture has kind of been if you don't have these certain set of skills, then you are not there's no space for you here. So we're kind of opening that up, and we're well, no, this is an industry where we have finfish farming that has a really bad rap right now. And so that is just an indication that we need to throw as many diverse minds, innovations, change makers, ideas, whatever, to make that as sustainable as possible. So it's just me really respecting and honoring the industry in itself and just saying, yeah, let's get more people. And it just so happens that they're, minorities.
So in many cases, I know for people that you're talking to, this feels like a new thing. Oh, I could get into this field. But it's making me think about this notion of the return generation, which is this phrase that a lot of young Black farmers are claiming. So I wonder if you can, explain that phrase for people, what it maybe means to you. Is it a term that resonates for you? And if so, why is the history that it's kind of referring to important? And how does it shape the work that you're doing?
Sure. Yeah. Wow, there's a lot there. I would say for me, just piggybacking on what you're saying, when I came into the space of food and urban agriculture, I actually did not grow. I was a single mom who grew up in the Bronx, went to college, came back to the Bronx, and had a son right after college, and started thinking about healthy food when my health started to fail, and then thinking about what to give my son. So I say that because you're right, there's a lot of entry points in agriculture for folks. And I think oftentimes we might have histories, personal or family histories around agriculture, and when we think further back, it can get even further complicated. But I think what I hear from a lot of folks that are growers now or want to be growers is that they want to return to indigenous practices. They want to return to resilient practices. They realize that these are the keys, the tools, the lessons that will help us not just thrive, but survive. And to me, that speaks of resiliency. And while I'm not a grower myself, what I felt like I could bring was like policy work and being that connective tissue and doing that work. But what I think is oftentimes some folks have connections to agriculture around slavery or growing in trauma. But I think a lot of folks now are connecting to growing because they see it as self-determination. They see it as liberation. And so when you take it from the individual and all the healing aspects of just touching water or touching soil, but when you expand that and scale it up to potentially growing for your community, growing for a business, growing to feed even more folks, I think for a lot of folks, it becomes the power that they haven't had in their life. And so to me, my magic to bring into this work is amplifying that. I think we know that there are a lot of folks that are living in disparity or have been impacted by it. I think we know that there are abundance of wealth and services and resources. So I think it's using this light skin and freckles to get folks closer to resources, to be completely honest. And get folks a chance that often don't see themselves as leaders, be leaders. And folks that don't see themselves as entrepreneurs, become that. But also that there is no shame in also doing agriculture or food-based work that is just healing your soul or fueling your community, and that's okay too. But on the flip side of that, we should also be open and have the opportunity to fail if we're creating opportunities around economic development and business. And I think oftentimes, even in my work outside of food and ag before I got into it, we do not have spaces for women. We don't have spaces for LGBTQ folks. We don't have spaces for trans folks and other historically marginalized folks to fail. Even when you work in nonprofit space, you don't get the chance to fail. You have to be perfect. You got to get that grant in. You got to do it right. And as I got into my work and as I had the fortunate work of going from a volunteer to a part-time manager around like working with CSAs and farmers and eventually running a nonprofit, what I realized is part of what I can also bring to the food and ag space is, part-time opportunity, full-time opportunity, but also give folks that don't get a chance to fail a chance to fail. And when I say fail, it just means to experiment, to be curious, that there's funding to do that. You can figure out what you need and then move it forward and not feel like that's the way, that one failure is where you stop. Because what we see oftentimes in our food and ag space is other parts of the business get to fail. You get, there are some folks in venture, that are venture capitalist backed or have angel funders that get millions, and they are built to fail in order to think of new innovations. So not that I get millions and I haven't gotten the billions, but to me it was like, how do we create space for folks that are trying to figure out how to grow in an urban setting, how to figure out folks that want to start a business and not quite sure, because oftentimes we don't always get the chance to go to business school, but are there ways to get the training that can help those folks figure it out? And I think for me, it's really creating space like that, whether I'm doing my work in consulting or even at the city level. Are we creating spaces for folks that are not the most famous or not the most obvious to really get in touch with what their skill set is and how they can expand that for themselves and for the larger community?
Wow. Okay. I'm supposed to go after that?
Sorry.
Jesus.
Sorry. I
All
remember.
right. No, I'm kidding. No, that was amazing. That was amazing. And you said it like, there were so many things in there that I was like, yeah. That like, just like really like, it's so crazy because, you're on land and
Yes.
I'm on water, but,
Yes.
kind of what you were saying of like that return generation, that's absolutely happening on the water too.
That's great.
We had, African Americans specifically were one of the most prominent demographics within commercial fisheries, especially on the Chesapeake Bay. So all of the innovations, all of the tools, all of the gear was 9 times out of 10 was made and curated by an African American person at some point when we were in the hundreds of thousands and it wasn't looked at as like a very viable career, right? Especially now if you see like $1 million homes on the water. Living on the water was not a high commodity. It was like where black and brown people were pushed to. Eating seafood was a poor man's thing. Lobsters right now, will they go like $75 a pound? They were called the roaches of the sea at one point. So it is
So
a return. It is a returning thing, but it's like also like we only have 12 living African American captains left on the Chesapeake Bay. All of them are over the age of 60. Oldest is 84, with no younger generation coming behind them. And so it's like, are we returning or are we trying to preserve? Are we trying to just like save any part that we have in it? Because there's already this like narrative that like, oh, well, like people of color like aren't into the environment, aren't into farming. Like I get that question all the time of like, well, how do you get them interested in what you're doing? And I'm like, no, we're already interested. And bringing in that cultural side, it only makes it a lot stronger because I can say, this isn't something that I'm just trying to like, create a DEI path. Like, no, I'm trying to like get us back to where we were before. But it's also like aquaculture is the new wave of commercial fisheries. So it like only makes sense if we were a part of it here that we should be a part of it here. It just looks a little differently. And I think like, in my research, because I'm, my thesis topic is the historic contributions of African Americans in Chesapeake Bay commercial fisheries. So what I found is that like we have reduced down that story to racial oppressions, which I'm not saying is like not part of the story, but I don't think that it's like the end all be all of it. And so for me, I really tried to find what were those domino effects from like 1836 when we were working in fisheries enslaved to like all the way to now. How did we get from hundreds of thousands to 12?
Yep.
And it can't just be racial oppression. There's like so many other nuances in there that I've found that are just so interesting. But I think like it's, for me, the returning, years of returning era is like me trying to like make sure that as we move into this new space, like we're preserved like on the back end, because there's a lot of stories and a lot of people that I have come across or heard from other watermen that I look up and there's no written publications or information about them at all. So once those watermen die, what happens to that one person? They never get talked about ever again. But one of them was the largest black crab buyer in the history of Maryland.
Wow.
There's only one article about him at the Star Democrat when he passed away. Like, what does that say?
Yeah. We were just talking about how
Exactly.
history gets recorded and whose stories are considered
We're
important.
such a good panel. We just have so many connections.
No, totally. I
please.
would love to. I'm really glad that you said again a lot of gems as well, and it also makes me think about even in New York City, our disconnect to water, and our disconnect to being, whether it's living and being redlined away from water, but right, so many times when you think about it, Black and brown folks were moved to the water, which is ironic now that we're dealing with climate crisis and flooding. But even in the history of like oysters and food, New York, oysters are also native in New York and New York City harbors. And our indigenous folks, our Lenape, were the folks who really harvest and cook and bring it in. And then over time, free folks and non-free folks started also connecting that to our culture and our history and our food, but also our livelihood. And the equipment, and even building equipment, so it's not always just agriculture. So sometimes when we talk about agriculture, people only think about the farming aspect, where there's this whole value chain of like work and need and skill. Yes. Whole supply chain. And then I would say even in New York, we're probably even further disconnected from our maritime roots and our connections to oysters and our connections to it being like food, but also the remediation that oysters can bring. And there's like efforts to bring that back. And there clearly have been efforts in environmental justice work on our coastal areas and harbors and peninsulas in New York City. But again, there's still very few folks that are doing that. And when you think about trying to do that for a living, then it's even less. And the opportunities to do that is even less. So it's like important to have that work, but that connection to history. So it's like you said, it's not just what is innovative now, and then you have like new folks coming in, but it's also like, are we actually preserving a connection to what was already here? And that be part of our history and story now, and that's what we're telling.
Yeah, how we made the comeback.
Yeah. So is it a return or is it a comeback?
Yeah,
Maybe it's a comeback.
Well, Qiana, you just mentioned climate change, and I wanted to follow up on that and ask you both. We've been thinking about the past. Now I want to sort of switch to the present and the future, although I think we can see connections when we think about the kinds of innovations that you were talking about that people have made, and how people who are closest to the water or the land are the ones who notice the climate changes first, right?
Yep.
And I'm wondering what kinds of impacts you are thinking about, seeing, noticing, and planning for, and how is climate change affecting the work that you both are doing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, with aquaculture, the ocean is changing, and that is affecting the food that we can grow and the different process that goes into that and how it's affected. And so I think that it's only gonna, hopefully it doesn't get any worse, but I think that aquaculture was introduced to be the support system for our wild fisheries, right? Mm-hmm. We came in a little bit hot, which I've told a lot of people in aquaculture of like, it's gonna replace wild fisheries, right? And I think that rubbed people the wrong way, rightfully so. And and then we like have something that we say is gonna replace wild fisheries, but then we don't put enough information out about it. And then the only information that consumers do have is negative publicity, like Seaspiracy and all these other things that don't tell the whole truth. But that is the only truth that is out there. So I can understand why people are like, no, aquaculture isn't a pathway forward into climate change or remediation or anything like that. But it really is, right? One oyster farmer puts out 2 million oysters in a year just by themselves. Even if those oysters aren't in the water for a day or a week or a month or however long, one adult oyster can filter 50 gallons of water a day. And if you have 2 million in one spot around other farms, that's so many oysters that are really just working overtime to get that environment back to equilibrium. And so I think that when it comes to oyster farming. That is the most sustainable protein that we can eat, and it's one of the most sustainable sectors of aquaculture. So I think there are nuances there that do help us with climate change. But I think for me, I'm focusing on, okay, everyone understands for the most part like that climate change is bad and like kind of what's happening, but are we talking about like solutions? And aquaculture is a solution, but now we've got to kind of get over this hump of kind of a little bit of a setback of people don't really understand aquaculture to its fullest. And so yeah, it's kind of a disservice to aquaculture. It's a disservice to our communities that could be using different practices.
Absolutely.
That, you know, hydroponics is becoming a huge thing. That's a mash between what me and you both do. So I think it's there that we haven't really explored what all that we can do in these spaces.
Agreed. No, I totally agree. Something that I think is really important for folks to hear and connect dots to is, and I think sometimes we see it better actually in other global cities and spaces, is the deep connection between our natural resources and how those are our keys to survival around a resilient future and building a resilient future. And what I see here, right, in our national agriculture is we're still trying to work through our disconnect in agriculture and seeing it as a critical part of not just climate injustice, but how can we build nature-based solutions? If I bring that lens a little bit closer to urban agriculture, what kind of like what you were saying is like the need for the information and awareness that agriculture is agriculture, and urban agriculture is an aspect of that. And while there are some differences between our rural ag and urban, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have a place in our work. And that urban agriculture also needs to be seen in any major city, if not smaller cities as well, as a critical component of a climate action strategy and a plan. Just like you also need to consider like your water supply. I know in New York City, we do a lot of talking about stormwater. We talk a lot about flooding. You know, so we talk about the waters in terms of what it's impacting us and like where we're already built. And I think part of that, you know, in terms of thinking of nature-based solutions, one of the things that people I think forget is for a lot of folks, urban agriculture is their first connection and exposure to climate crisis or solutions. Whether it's through growing, because now you're building natural-based carbon sinks and you're sequestering carbon in the air, whether it's through food production and growing healthy soils in order to grow healthy food, or whether it's just having soil instead of concrete somewhere, so there's somewhere for the water to get absorbed by versus it just like running off and flooding. But if we don't see that urban agriculture is our like a connection to nature-based solutions, or we only let folks do it at these smaller scales, we're missing the impacts of it being part of a critical action plan. I think for, you know, the average New Yorker, and I would imagine just average folks, when you think of growing, if you close your eyes and think of growing, or you think of climate, you don't often start at the highest part, unless you're a scientist. You know, like people need to feel, and a lot of times agriculture gives folks that connection, like I can make a change. I could be a climate steward. This could be, you know, individually driven in my solutions. It could also, I can work together and build connective and collective power to build solutions. And what I'm trying, you know, what I think climate crisis gives us the chance to is not just understand it in data and charts and maps, but how do we understand what we're able to do just in our home, to our neighborhood, to our community. And I think urban agriculture gives us, whether we notice it or not, like that first direct connection. And urban can also mean just where you're living. Not all of us live, say, in New York City, but some of us live in peri-urban spaces. That's urban as well. And so I think it's just also for folks to understand, like, if we're thinking about agriculture and what we know already is true, how do we build and expand on that impact? But then how do we increase awareness so folks feel like they can make a change, and that part can actually be built into a bigger part? I totally like went off track, but one thing I wanted to say was like we need feasible solutions, and I think agriculture, and I think the work Imani's doing as well, it gives folks, all of us, a chance to build tools, increase our information, our resources, and our awareness, and build strategies that actually be feasible, that actually can be resilient. And I hope that when we talk about climate change, it's not always from the top, but we're really thinking about the ground, from the ground up or from the water.
Yeah, there you go.
So let me just follow up. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Thanks so much. We have some wonderful pictures at the Library of Congress of New York City back in the early 1900s,
Yes.
with lots of school gardens
Yes.
and lots of community gardens.
Yes.
And I wondered if they fall under your aegis, or if that's in the education department. And what about green roofs? Are you doing a lot in New York City with green roofs and growing?
Sure, thanks for asking. So one slight caveat, I am happy to talk about my what's happening in New York City, but I'm not here as a city representative. But it's really interesting that you mentioned that. One thing I can share is, yes, long story short, New York City has a rich urban ag history. And the pictures are very inspiring, what you're speaking of. Like, people oftentimes think of the concrete jungle that New York City is, but there used to be even windowsill gardening. There was gardening growing on a roof before we called it rooftop gardening. There were school gardens, there were learning gardens, there were just neighborhood plots that folks are able to grow for their own families in here. And those pictures, I think, are even surprising to New Yorkers. Fun fact, I wanted to put those pictures in the city's first urban agriculture report. And while they didn't get in, I'm hoping to continue to share that history, because I do think seeing what New York used to look like and how green it was and how people were actually growing is actually important on telling the story on what we need in New York City now. So the first city's urban ag report is out. It just got released this week. And what I'm hoping to do is, as I continue to do more public-facing work in that capacity, is bring in some of those photos and tell just a slight touch of that history of where the growing was. But even in contemporary times, when folks think about urban agriculture in New York City, community gardens, we still have thriving community gardens, community land trusts, in the city now, and that's really, again, through sweat equity. There were folks that turned abandoned lots, unutilized lots, former buildings that were just rubble, neighborhoods that businesses had disenfranchised and left, where folks were like, we're gonna stay and we're gonna stay here, but we need to grow and we want to build self-determination. So in my work, in my city role, I do support the breadth of urban ag, but I do think part of that is sharing more history around it, so folks know how we got here, but how we're going to move forward. And I do think green roofs will be a part of that breadth of urban ag in any city. But I think it also we have to consider energy considerations. Again, are they helping absorb water? Are they helping with solar? But I think it's something that can continue to expand, and especially when we think of like just normal size rooftops, not always just the big industrial rooftops that people are familiar with. Sorry, I'm moderating, sorry.
Okay. Another fun fact, and to answer something a little bit to you, many, many years ago, Zabar's in New York City.
Yeah.
I'm from Long Island, so I know about
nice.
Zabar's.
Okay.
He created one of the first rooftop gardens because he had a bakery.
Yes.
And they were baking bread. So
Yes.
what they did was they funneled all of the heat, the external heat, because they started the ovens around 4 o'clock in the morning. So he was able to have a rooftop garden
great.
12 months of the year.
And
And that is the key. So get every bakery in New York City and every city to start putting up urban gardens on their roofs.
That is great.
I
That's
know.
actually a good tip. Because now you're talking about all the things that we have to deal with, right, in our modern realities. Is we want to have comfort and convenience. So what do we do with heat? We oftentimes talk about urban heat island effect, but not thinking about the heat that comes from buildings. Another great way too that we can have year-round production, and that's what we need in New York City is greenhouses and green roofs, but they don't have to be fancy. Sometimes it could be as simple as hoop houses that we see. But I love that idea about the heat from the building or like industry. And again, these are the ideas that are not, these are still innovative. And I think oftentimes what I tell folks is when we think about innovation, it's not monolithic to just tech. It's not monolithic to just contemporary inventions. Oftentimes our solutions are at our touch and it's our savviness. It's do you have the resources to build that out and scale it up, and how many people are going to be able to do that. But thank you for sharing that.
Are there other questions in the audience? Paula, there's one here in the.
This is mostly for Imani, but Qiana, you would know too because you went to Hampton University.
Yes.
But I grew up in Hampton, and we had abundant oysters. Our property was on Back River, which it empties into the Chesapeake Bay. The oysters are gone. We had abundant oysters and clams, and you could walk out at low tide and dig bushels.
Wow.
So, is it because, and I'm not slamming the Air Force, but is it the runoff from the jet fuel, or because our property Back River literally is the flight line for the jets.
Gotcha.
Do you know anything about Back River and its lack of?
I know a little. I mean, I just when it comes to Maryland's aquaculture, it kind of gets tied into Virginia's aquaculture too, just because we're all right there. I think it's a combination of things, and I think that just goes into why aquaculture was introduced in the first place, back in the 1990s, because of there was over-harvesting, all of these different changes, but then you had oyster diseases that came in that when oyster farming or when oyster populations were at its lowest, hanging on by a thread kind of was the double whammy that came in and wiped out everything. So even in Maryland, we're down to less than 1% of our historic numbers, and I think that also includes Virginia too, because we're all in the Chesapeake Bay. So there's a lot of things that go into it, which is why we can't just pinpoint it to one thing at a time.
Right.
So it could be, but it also could be what's also coming down, the bay that way, or what's coming from another tributary. It could be anything, right? But I think that it's mostly we have to find solutions on how do we make oysters more resilient, which is what aquaculture's mission is. Not to create a genetically modified oyster, but pretty much to just say, okay, well, conditions have changed. How do we get them to be more hardy in these conditions?
Yep.
No matter if they go from very, very high to very, very low. And so that's kind of where we are now. So I know that Chesapeake Bay Foundation and a lot of these other organizations are putting back oysters, things like that. So I'm hoping that that will, kind of get us back to robust numbers. I don't know.
I would love for someone to repopulate Back River. That would be nice.
You gotta definitely reach out to Chesapeake Bay Foundation, because if you're, because they're really great about trying to find different solutions that work for different areas, right? So that'd be great.
That would be great.
Thank you for that question.
I know. Shout out to Hampton.
Yeah.
Nice.
Is there another question?
Small
I'm
world.
having a hard time seeing in the audience.
Yeah, one back there. I know my glasses.
I know.
Yeah. I'm excited. While we're waiting for the next question, it does make me think about some of the projects in New York around cleaning our water and utilizing oysters in order to help with water remediation.
Billion Oyster Project.
Billion Oyster Project. Yeah.
This is kind of a practical urban agriculture question. A lot of my friends and neighbors would like to start a small, either a backyard garden or something on the roof. But a lot of the backyard, the small space that's available is adjacent to alleys. And in DC, we have a huge rat problem. And I'm wondering if you have any experience with in New York with how you start a garden and deal with that issue.
Okay. I think I'll say two things. I think that there are resources from land stewards that are quite familiar with growing in urban spaces, even small spaces, that would probably be the best for you. And I would happy to share what I can share off the stage. But I think in terms of the larger, just because I can't speak for the city right now, but I do think there's a lot of practicality and resources that might be helpful. I think oftentimes people think because it's too small of a space that they can't grow. And what I've seen in New York City is whether a pot or windowsill or roof or even like matchbox size, like people can still grow. The other thing I would say though is in terms of the rat problem, what I've heard from gardeners is oftentimes what people think are the food that's growing in the garden is attracting the rats. Gardeners actually typically use a lot of integrative pest management. And what we've seen in the city and what gardeners in New York have told me is oftentimes it's not the food that they're growing that's bringing the rats in. The rats are actually using gardens as like pathways to get to buildings or to get to trucks or to get to the street. The reality is it's us. It's humans leaving trash open or unsaved. And I know that the city, in New York City, we're trying to do more around closed garbage, but it's also just what we find in our floor and what we think is small. Also holes. Like oftentimes, rats are actually running through the gardens in order to get from A to B or hiding food. And the reason why I say that is many times gardeners are actually doing things to keep pests out of the garden, whether it's raised beds, whether it's putting, safe but manageable things around to kind of minimize that and minimize that exposure. But I don't think what we have found or what we are seeing is not so much the growing of the food, not to say that, animals won't eat, people eat food, squirrels will eat as well. But I think there are multiple strategies to kind of help mitigate that. And I think it gives us the opportunity to share and learn, training and resources from each other, but also in different cities, how to mitigate and how to either advocate for what you want in your neighborhood that can address issues near gardens and in communities. But oftentimes it's like the other garbage that's bringing the rats in and kind of supporting their lifestyles.
Oh my God. Oh my gosh.
But I would love to share what I know with you.
Looks like we have another question in the back.
Hi, I just want to say I'm a big fan of your work in like lower income areas in New York, and I've been doing a lot of research on it lately.
Thanks.
And I'd love to know your opinion on policy and programs like SNAP and WIC in those areas, and if you see urban agriculture becoming a way for people to like only have one job and be able to work in agriculture and create and like help those programs. Like, should we be focusing on long-term solutions like you are, or also improving our like policy in those areas, or do they kind of go hand in hand?
Oh yeah, no, great question. I know this is a little off our topic, but if it's okay. I think one of the things that's important about agriculture, even in urban agriculture, is the connection between who is growing our food and who is, the end consumer. And even when we're thinking about SNAP, I think, being in DC and being in a farm bill season, policy becomes, right, a hot topic. What I often tell folks is if we take a step back from what people tell us are the lines and really think about solidarity and really think about how we can support one another, then policy can actually be an action for change. So I've tried to bring that into thinking about, not just in my current job, but in past policy work. How do we connect food and ag? If we're supporting farmers that are growing food, does that also help how we're creating access and economic power for farmers and also folks that are food insecure. SNAP is one of those great tools. So oftentimes we end the conversation in talking about SNAP is just food insecure folks and using dollars and the extreme amount of cost. But what we're not talking about is how often SNAP can actually be used to support fresh food access, and using economic power for food insecure folks to be able to get fresh food. And I think when we think about that with our policy, it's less about, we should be protecting SNAP at all costs by any means, but it's also around thinking about policy like SNAP Ed that can support culinary education so folks know what to do with fresh food, know how to preserve it, know how to cook it, bringing in more culturally relevant food. But then the policy doesn't just support folks to protect SNAP to use it, but we're also creating policy or advocating for policy that supports folks to use SNAP at farmers markets, CSAs, fresh food sites, where then now that's going directly to farmers and helping, protect programming that supports farmers around marketing and awareness to get SNAP further in community and for folks to use it. I think there was another part of your question in terms of not just policy. Yes, I think it's always important to focus on grassroots efforts because, again, I think for most people that's their most direct connection to building change. I think oftentimes we're told that change takes too long or it's going to be too small of a scale. And what I actually think is when we get beyond our individual selves and think about building collective power and say even using policy like that, how do you support different policies that can support beyond your initial individual needs? We actually see that there's ways to support power and collective power because we're trying to address structural disparity, right? When you're talking about SNAP, we're talking about food insecurity. It's not going to go away easily. But what we're able to do is support folks that grow food, whether on the water or land. We want to support policies that do that. I think we see whether you're a rural farmer or an urban farmer, it can be hard to make a living. So I think if we continue to connect to why do we need to support our agriculture sector, and why do we need to support, specialty crops and fruit and vegetables, because that's specialty crops, and also like other crops, legumes, fisheries. Like I think the more we think about not just think about ourselves as individuals, but think about how we can support the agriculture sector, it will make being a farmer more of an opportunity of a livelihood and less of something that most farmers are going to have to do off-farm income for. So I think, long story short, when we only think small and people will tell you to think small about grassroots, it actually can have bigger impact when you're building collective power. And yes, right now, for a lot of folks, urban ag is not going to be the thing they're able to do for a living. But I'm hoping, again, with more innovative policy that has equity integrated into it, even around agriculture, we're supporting rural farmers to be able to build livelihoods. We're supporting fisher folk to create livelihood and focus on that agriculture aspect, and also create those opportunities at the urban ag. In urban ag, it might look like starting a business. It might look like doing school garden maintenance or scaling up an urban farm to that and allowing folks to be able to build a business, whether it's on a rooftop or in soil.
So on that hopeful note, we are going to have to start drawing to a close. Before we thank our speakers, I just have a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, please sign up for the American Food History Project's newsletter to learn about more upcoming programming in 2024. There are survey and comment cards on the chairs, and we invite you to let us know your thoughts about the program through those. And then please stick around for our next program, a Cooking Up History program with Mariah Gladstone, Blackfeet Cherokee, revitalizing indigenous food knowledge and healthier ecosystems, which starts at 3:30 right here in Coulter Plaza.
That sounds exciting.
So please join me in thanking Paula Johnson and our hosts at the museum and our wonderful panelists.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you all.
We need like 2 hours.
Thank you very much. We'll be right back here in half an hour with Mariah Gladstone. And thank you, panel. It was fantastic.